In the fall of 1987, a ranger stationed at Windmere Lookout swore he saw a man standing still in the fog below. Just standing there. He never moved, never looked away. 3 years before that, my brother vanished, and that ranger never filed a report. But I remember the way his voice broke when he told me about it a decade later, like he knew he'd seen something that shouldn't have been there. Something that wasn't finished. Something that might still be watching. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name is Rachel Mercer. I've worked with the U.S. Park Service for nearly 20 years. I was born in Oregon, raised just south of Eugene. Crater Lake always felt like a second home. Its cliffs, its quiet, the way the light shifted across the water like a held breath. By the time I was in my early 30s, I'd worked posts in 4 different states, but I kept coming back here. The work was steady, mostly search and rescue, prep, backcountry enforcement weather logs. A few missing hikers each season, but nothing that didn't sort itself out by dusk. That's how it felt like everything out here obeyed the clock. Miles Hagen and I had shared shifts since '92. He was older, calmer, always carried one of those steel thermoses that smelled like burnt coffee and pine resin. He didn't talk much, but he listened. Back then, we'd talk trail conditions, waterline erosion, migratory tracking, normal things, safe things. I never once told him about my brother, not in those early years. Daniel disappeared in 1984. We were teenagers. My parents said he went hiking alone and got turned around. That maybe he slipped near the western ridge. The official report said likely fall-related trauma. Closed it by the end of summer. But I never believed it. Because Daniel didn't go out there alone. He hated being cold, hated fog, and he always came home before dark. In September of '97, I was back at Crater Lake full-time. Seasonal fires had cleared out most of the underbrush along the south ridge, and the air had that dry, high-altitude crispness that settles in just before the first frost. It was during an inventory check that I found the old incident logs from the Windmere Lookout Tower, a file dated October 3, 1987, marked Visual Contact, No Engagement. A ranger named Don Weaver had signed it. But the coordinates matched the same area where Daniel's compass had last pinged before the signal failed. I stared at that page for a long time. Miles and I found Don living in a trailer outside Grants Pass. He was retired by then, bent slow to move but clear-eyed when I mentioned Daniel's name. He didn't hesitate. "I saw him," he said. "Not the boy. The other one." We sat outside under a pine tree that had gone brittle with drought. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the needles. "I didn't go public," he told us. "Nobody would have listened anyway." That night I lay awake in the staff quarters, maps spread across my floor. I circled the points Daniel's last known location, the other disappearances the old sightings logged and then forgotten. They formed a pattern, almost a crescent, all of it wrapping around a narrow gorge on the western ridge. Bare Needle Hollow. It had been erased from trail maps after the rock slide in '89, but it was still there, hidden, quiet. The next morning, Miles offered to take the old maintenance path in. We packed light, no team, no chatter. I remember thinking maybe we'd find an old boot print, a rusted can, some sign that the past had moved on. Instead, we found a hinge, half buried in the soil, clinging to what might have once been a door. And suddenly I knew. Daniel had come here. And whatever he'd found, it hadn't let him leave. Miles crouched beside the collapsed beams, fingers tracing the rusted hinge that jutted from a rotted doorframe, and neither of us said much for the first few minutes. The old cabin was barely a cabin anymore. Just a sagging outline of what it might have once been, weather-worn logs half swallowed by ivy and thick beds of lichen, a roof long since buckled under snow. You could tell it hadn't been disturbed in years, not by people at least. But there was something deliberate about it, something purposeful in the way it had been built just out of view, nestled so deep in the bowl of Bare Needle Hollow that it vanished completely unless you were right on top of it. Miles brushed aside a clump of moss near what had once been a window and stepped back. There, he said quietly. Beneath the ivy carved into the timber frame were the initials H.C. Howard Clemens. I felt the name in my chest before I even said it aloud. It was like stumbling into the last page of a book you thought had no ending. We didn't know then how much more there was to read. Inside, what remained was skeletal. A single cot frame half sunken into the soil. A corner of rusted metal that might have been a stove. And beneath what used to be a floorboard near the far wall, something wedged tight in the crevice, a small sealed metal box wrapped in waxed canvas. Miles worked it loose with the blade of his pocket knife, careful not to damage the seal. When we finally pried it open, the contents were bone dry. A brittle notebook, a sliver of a sharpened knife, and a single photograph edges curled with age. The picture showed a woman standing beside an old pickup, smiling with her hand on her hip. On the back, in neat faded pencil, it said Margaret, 1952. I don't know why that shook me more than the knife. It made him real again, not just a name in a report. A man who loved someone. A man who once lived a normal life before he walked into these woods and didn't come out. The notebook was dense with writing. No dates, no names. Just lines of observations, weather patterns, animal tracks. Notes on hikers who passed too close fire schedules. Ranger patrols. One line read, "Saw another. Hiker tall, backpack blue. Stayed out of sight." They camped near Ridge 3, came too close. Waited until dawn to move. Page after page described people like that, moving near him, around him, unaware they were being watched. He kept himself invisible, or tried to. But near the end of the journal, a single entry stood apart. It was written in a different tone, like the rest had been habit, and this one had weight. The boy asked me my name. I said nothing. He stood still. He looked like he knew me. I turned away. I read it twice. "That could be Daniel," I said quieter than I meant to. Miles didn't argue, but I could hear the hesitation in his breath. We logged everything, sealed the notebook and box, and called in for evidence transport. But we didn't leave the site, not right away. Something in the air held us there like unfinished breath. Then one of the younger rangers, Dylan, called from farther down the slope. "You'll want to see this," he said. We followed his voice through the brush to where the ravine cut deeper into the hollow. The ground was soft with pine needles and shale, and halfway down the incline, caught on a low branch, was a torn scrap of nylon, faded, but unmistakably orange. The exact color of the backpack Daniel had been carrying when he disappeared. I dropped to my knees and cleared the soil beneath it. My hand brushed against something solid. The frame of a backpack, partially crushed metal, warped with time, but still intact. Inside, under layers of wet pine mulch, we found fragments of its contents. A cracked compass, a snapped plastic fork, a leather-bound notebook swollen with water but still holding shape. I turned it over in my hands like it might fall apart. "It's his," I said, and I knew it was. No one else would have had it. Miles opened a small film canister tucked in the side pouch. Inside, dry against all odds, was a tightly rolled piece of undeveloped 35mm film. We'd need a lab to process it, but even in that moment, it felt like a breath held in time, like Daniel had left us something to find. Then another voice called out, not panicked but off. "Over here," one of the rangers said. We followed him to a low outcrop near the base of the ravine. A few stones had been stacked in a rough circle too precise to be natural. Beneath them, bones. Small, likely animal, but arranged in deliberate patterns, always in pairs, always facing each other. And beside them, wrapped in wax cloth like a message, was a torn page from a journal. The handwriting was clear. He told me he used to be someone else, said the world was too loud, that he came here to forget. But the memories still follow him through the trees. He said I was the first person he'd spoken to in years. He's afraid of what he's become. I don't remember standing up. Just the sound of Miles reading the last line aloud. Then we pressed on deeper into the ravine. The light faded fast down there, even before sunset. The trees grew tighter, the rocks turned sharp, and eventually the ground leveled out into a narrow clearing no bigger than a cabin floor. At the center of it, a mound. Not fresh, not recent, but shaped marked once by wood that had long since rotted. An old grave. We didn't speak, just moved in quiet rhythm, clearing the top layer of leaves, digging with gloved hands and folding tools. The earth was dry below the first few inches, packed hard. When we reached the coat wool degraded, we stopped. The remains inside were human, bones curled by time, a rusted dog tag looped around the neck cord. Miles wiped it clean and held it toward the fading light. Clemens, H. U.S. Army, 1944. He looked at me, but I had no words. He died here, alone. But someone buried him. Someone who stayed. That was the part I couldn't shake. Because if Clemens died out here, then someone else took his place. Someone else kept the fire going, left the stones watched from the trees. And that someone was still out there. We didn't pack up right away. We just stood there, both of us turned back toward the tree line. And I don't know if it was instinct or memory, but the forest around us felt different. Not colder, not darker, just aware, like it had always known we were coming, and it was waiting for what we'd find next. I didn't sleep that night, neither did Miles. We stayed at the Ranger HQ, going over everything again, notes from the field photos, voice memos, whatever we had logged from Bare Needle Hollow, and it still didn't make sense. Clemens was dead. We had the grave, the dog tag, the coat. But the sightings, they kept coming after his death. I found myself flipping through old case logs like they were puzzle pieces someone had tossed into the wrong box. One of them was from 1987, the same year Don Weaver swore he saw a man watching from the Windmere Tower. The date was October 3rd. I stared at it until the timestamp felt burned into my brain. Clemens couldn't have been there. He was already buried. We'd stood over his bones ourselves, which meant someone else was out there. Had been for years. Someone who either picked up where Clemens left off or had been there all along, blending into the space he left behind. I went back to Daniel's waterlogged notebook. Most of it had been too damaged to read, but a few pages were still intact. I used a magnifier and a soft pencil to trace the legible lines. One said, "He watched me from across the ridge again." Said nothing. He knew I had a sister. I never told him. That stopped me cold. Daniel never mentioned me in public. We weren't close in that way, not like some siblings. So how would a stranger have known that? And if it wasn't Clemens who had been watching him, another line was underlined faintly in smudged pencil. Not Clemens. Different eyes. Younger. Stillness was different. I copied it onto a fresh sheet of paper and sat with it. Stillness was different. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I kept reading it over and over as if maybe the words would change under my breath. Later that morning, I started combing through the park's old incident records. Not the digitized ones, those don't go back far enough. I had to get into the boxed archives in the basement. I pulled the logs from 1980 to 1984 and cross-referenced them with any names tied to citations or unusual reports. There wasn't much. A couple of missing camper notes, a bear incident, one unverified wildlife sighting that got flagged as a possible cougar. But then I found it. A marginal note handwritten in the corner of a report from July 1981. It said, "Solo hiker seen near Ridge 5, no permit. Given water. Advised, re-cliff hazards. HC." That's Howard Clemens. The report didn't go anywhere. No follow-up, no missing person filed in our system, but it was enough to check external records. I called a contact in Jackson County and asked if anyone matching that timeline had vanished in or near Crater Lake between 80 and 83. A couple hours later, they sent a short file. Name Michael Lantry, 26, drifter from Northern California, arrested once for illegal camping, released. Last known sighting July 1981. No formal missing person filed. Presumed transient. I looked at the file for a long time before I called Miles over. It might not have been Clemens who took Daniel, I said. It might have been someone who came after. Someone who found that cabin. Someone who never left. Miles didn't answer right away. He just looked at the photo ID in the report. Michael had a diagonal scar across his right cheek. That stood out. He wore a long coat in the photo thin denim torn at the collar. There was no family listed, no forwarding address. Just the words released, no charges filed. What if he didn't vanish? I said. What if he stayed? That afternoon we returned to Bare Needle Hollow, this time with a wider team and a tighter focus. We weren't looking for burial sites or structures. We were looking for signs of habitation, old traps, supply caches, anything that might have been used more recently. The forest in that part of the park had a way of swallowing time. You could walk past a footprint and never know it had been there. But we found them. Tarp fragments caught under boulders. Wire snares still partially intact. A tin box hidden under a slab of moss-covered shale. Inside were small bones, bird feathers, and 6 carved wooden figures, crude and human-shaped, each with a slash carved across the face. They were arranged in a row, carefully nested into cloth like they mattered. One of the figures was different, taller, smoother, unmarked. I turned it over in my hand and said nothing. Miles was the one who spoke. "This isn't survival," he said. "This is something else." Then the radio cracked. A ranger stationed just north of the hollow called in. "You're going to want to see this." We hiked up to the coordinates he gave and found a clearing we hadn't mapped. It had a stone circle at its center like a fire ring, but wrong, too flat, too wide. At its center was a single wooden post, aged gray and blackened at the base. Attached to it by a leather cord was a strip of faded orange cloth like something torn from a backpack. I didn't have to guess. It was Daniel's. Miles saw it too. But it was the carvings on the post that stayed with me. Dozens of them, all the same, DW, over and over again, scratched in layers, some shallow. Others gouged so deep the grain had splintered. Whoever did this didn't just come once. They came back, again and again. I started documenting the symbols. That's when I noticed the other carvings, spirals, squares, and crude stick figures with blank faces, no eyes or mouths. Miles looked over my shoulder. "This isn't a memorial," he said. "It's a record." We called in a specialist from the State University, an anthropologist named Dr. Lyndon Ash, who'd worked with park systems cataloging glyphs and survivalist iconography. She flew in the next morning and hiked out with us to examine the post. Her conclusion was blunt. These weren't indigenous. They weren't part of any tribal system or known ritual practice. They were invented. Likely by one person, she said, isolated, untrained, but deliberate. I asked her what the spiral meant. She ran a gloved finger along the grooves. Spiral can mean return, loop, entrapment. Then she pointed to the square. That's often shelter. And the faceless figure. She hesitated. It might be the observer, or the observed. We found more stone arrangements just beyond the clearing. Another pit, this one shallow and marked with 2 small bones placed side by side. Always one larger, always one smaller, like a set. Always facing each other. I stood over them with the wind in my ears and realized we'd been wrong about Daniel. He hadn't been dragged off in the dark by force. He'd been chosen. Someone out there had been watching him long before we knew, and whatever he saw that summer, it hadn't let go. We brought the carved figures back to HQ. I lined them up in the evidence room 6 with the face slashed one untouched. I don't know what made me say it, but I whispered, "This one is Daniel." If it was, then he'd been marked differently, not like the others. He hadn't been forgotten. That night the phone rang. Miles picked it up, listened in silence, then turned to me. "They developed the film," he said, "the one from Daniel's backpack. There's a photo." I didn't ask what was in it. I already knew. There'd be a fire, a tent, maybe a shadow, something between the trees, something with a face we hadn't seen yet, something watching, always watching. The photo was grainy, underexposed in the corners, but the frame told us more than I think any of us were ready to hear. It showed a small fire pit, nothing unusual. You could see the rounded edge of a sleeping bag, a tent flap half open, even Daniel's water flask tucked in the dirt like it had been nudged aside. But in the background, between two thin-trunked pines, there was a figure. Partially obscured by distance and the flare of the flash, only one shoulder and part of a face were visible, but the eye, that one exposed eye, caught the light and reflected it like a mirror. The lab tech adjusted the contrast again and again, but the shadows held. You could make out a muscular frame, a thick coat, a strap slung across the chest like he was carrying something, maybe gear, maybe something else. And on the cheek, clear enough to draw a breath from the room, was a scar. Diagonal, right side. It matched the arrest photo of Michael Lantry down to the angle. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I just stared at that single eye in the trees. Watching. Always watching. We sent the photo through state archives, but we already knew what it was. Confirmation, not discovery. Lantry hadn't just stayed in the forest. He'd survived in it long enough to become invisible. And Daniel had captured him, maybe by accident, maybe not. Either way, the camera was the last thing anyone ever got out. Miles and I drove back to the station in silence. Sometimes you don't talk because there's nothing to say, but this felt different. Like speaking might break something that hadn't fully taken shape yet. We both knew we were getting closer to whatever this was, but it wasn't closure. It was something colder. Something that didn't have an ending, just layers. The next morning I went back through Daniel's journal again. The entries were spare, almost detached in tone, but one line stuck out now in a way it hadn't before. He told me he used to be someone else. The world was too loud. He came here to forget. That wasn't Clemens. Clemens left records, war files, even old correspondences. He may have retreated, but he hadn't erased himself. Lantry, though. Lantry had no paper trail. No family. No missing report. Just a single arrest, a vanishing, and now a photo taken by a boy who'd never come home. He told him everything I said aloud without meaning to. Miles looked up. I handed him the journal. He wasn't taken. He was spoken to. Someone shared something with him, and then he stayed. We decided to retrace Daniel's final known campsite based on the topography in the photo. Miles had already matched the tree lines to a stretch just past Ridge 7 near a shelf of old basalt that had broken in a slide sometime in the late 80s. It wasn't on any public trail map now, but it was still walkable if you knew where to start. 3 hours into the hike, we found it. A hollow beneath a rock ledge, half covered in pine boughs and dust. The fire ring was still there, long dead, its stones blackened at the edges. Nearby, a crude shelter had been built into the slope, stitched together with weathered tarp and scavenged beams. Miles moved slow, careful not to disturb anything. I followed a faint path around the back, and that's where I saw it. A tree trunk wide and old, marked with initials. DW, ML, carved side by side, not stacked, not separated by time. They had been marked together. I stepped back and looked at Miles. He wanted it remembered, he said. I nodded, or someone did. A branch snapped uphill. We both froze. It wasn't the wind. You can tell the difference once you've spent enough seasons out in these woods. This was movement. Measured. Human. Another step. Then silence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call out. I just turned my head slightly, listening for breath for anything. But whatever or whoever it was had already gone still. The only sound now was the faint shake of needles in the high canopy. Miles whispered, "He's still out here." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew it in our bones. Lantry hadn't just survived out here. He'd adapted to it, learned how to disappear even when someone was standing 10 feet away. And if he was still alive, he was watching, just like he always had. We circled the area, marking prints and tool remains. There were signs of movement that were too fresh for comfort. Flattened, moss-broken twigs near waist height, a handmade snare that had been reset sometime within the last week. Then we found the second hollow tucked under another ledge closer to the creek bed. There was no shelter this time, just a wall, a natural curve in the rock face that had been scratched over and over with tiny figures. Dozens of them, maybe more. All faces, no eyes, no mouths, just blank sockets. All scratched with the same blade, the same pressure. Beneath them carved in uneven lettering again and again the same phrase, "You forget the face, but it never forgets you." Miles ran a hand across the stone and exhaled. He's trying to erase them. Or maybe himself. I opened one of the notebooks left near the base of the wall. The entries were chaotic, rambling paragraphs about weather and sounds and the position of the moon. But in between, I found something different. A page with no date, no heading, just a drawing. It was Daniel, sitting near a fire, looking directly at the viewer. His eyes had been scratched out. We didn't camp that night. We hiked back under low cloud cover radios clipped to our vests but kept silent. I carried the notebook like it would slip out of my hands if I didn't keep constant pressure. Back at base, I scanned the page under infrared. The margins held something almost invisible to the naked eye, charcoal markings, faint but intentional. Over and over in smaller and smaller script. She's coming. She always comes. I felt the hair on my arms lift. He'd known I would return. Not just expected it known it. Like this was a loop, not a line. Like the forest had been waiting, not wondering. There was one more hollow we hadn't explored. A collapsed section of Clemens's original cabin, its floorboards half swallowed by the earth. We'd left it alone the first time, too unstable. But now it felt necessary. I tapped gently along the floor, and when I heard the hollow sound, I peeled back the board. Wrapped in wax cloth was a reel of magnetic tape. An audio log. We brought it back to HQ and set it on the machine. The voice that came through was rough, unsteady. Male, middle-aged, but not Clemens. The tone was too modern, less formal. The man spoke slowly, like the words weighed something. He keeps saying my name, but he doesn't know me. I was watching, always watching. I never wanted to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand. Static crackled. Then, he ran. They always run, and she always comes. The reel clicked off. I sat back in my chair. The lights in the evidence room buzzed overhead. Somewhere outside, a breeze shook the pine limbs. I didn't say a word. I just looked down at the small wooden figurine I had kept from the set, the one without the slash. The one that didn't match the others. It still sat on the edge of the desk, facing the window. Watching. And in that moment, it felt like all the silence in those woods had followed us back, wrapped around us, waiting. I didn't go home that night. I stayed at HQ, sitting with the notebook pages, the figurine, the audio reel still threaded through the tape deck. I kept thinking about the voice dry, almost apologetic. Not confessing, not denying, just stating. He ran. They always run. And she always comes. The way he said it. It didn't sound like regret. It sounded like ritual, like something that had happened before and would happen again. Around 3 a.m, I took out Daniel's journal one more time and traced the handwriting with a light pen. There, almost buried in the corner of one page, I found it. A faint line I'd missed before. One stays. One sees. No punctuation. No context. But it was in the same ink as his final entry dated July 16, 1984, the day before the search team marked him missing. Miles showed up just after sunrise with 2 coffees, both too hot to drink. I handed him the journal without speaking. He read it in silence, then pointed to the edge of the page. "There," he said. "Look at the margin." I turned the book slightly, and under black light, another message appeared. Faint charcoal. A single line. I had to choose. We went back to Bare Needle Hollow that afternoon. This time I knew what I was looking for. The collapsed structure, the one we'd originally believed to be Clemens's first shelter, had a section of intact flooring near the back wall. We'd avoided it before because the beams looked unstable, but now I pressed my boot gently across the boards, listening for any difference in sound. The third one gave slightly. Hollow underneath. Miles helped me pry it loose, and there, wrapped in the same waxed cloth as the box we'd found before, was something heavier. An audio reel labeled only with a date, 7/18/84. We brought it back and loaded it carefully onto the same machine we'd used earlier. The tape was warped, a little degraded, but still playable. A man's voice, low, gravelly, hesitant. "He keeps talking in his sleep," the voice said. "Says my name, but we never met. He doesn't know I was watching. Not out there. In here. In the fire." A pause, then static. "Sometimes I wonder if he sees me." Another long silence. Then I didn't want to hurt him. I just wanted him to understand. But he ran. He ran into the trees. So I followed. They always run. Then finally, that same line again. "She always comes." The tape clicked off, leaving the room heavier than it had been. That night I stood alone at the crater rim lookout tower. Same one Don Weaver had used back in '87. The wind was steady coming down off the lake in slow, even pulses. You could hear the branches flexing below the creak of old wood under your boots. From that height you see everything. The water, the tree line, the dark ridge of the western basin where the hollow starts to curl into itself. But I wasn't looking at the lake. I was watching the forest, waiting for something to move. I pulled the figurine from my jacket, the unmarked one, and placed it on the railing facing the trees. I don't know why I did it. Maybe as a marker. Maybe as a sign. "You're not forgotten," I said quietly. Then I waited. Nothing moved at first, just wind. But then between 2 trees on the north slope, a shadow stepped out. Only for a second. Then it was gone. I didn't speak into the radio. I just listened. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even surprise. It was recognition. He was still there. And he knew I was too. Miles called up from base 15 minutes later. "You still at the tower?" he asked. I said yes. "You see something?" I didn't answer right away. I was watching the path below where the slope dipped just enough to hide a person in motion. "Something moved," I said finally. "I'm heading your way," he said. "Don't move." But I didn't stay. I stepped off the platform and walked down the ridge trail with my flashlight off, using only the last light of day. The trail narrowed near the southern bend. I knew it would. That was the point where the terrain shifted soft soil, turning sharp with shale and lichen. I followed the edge down into a shallow game trail. It wasn't one I recognized. Probably wasn't on any current map. It was worn smooth by habit, not by traffic. And it led straight back into Bare Needle Hollow. The clearing was the same stone circle wooden post, but something had changed. Fresh footprints in the pine needles. Deep, deliberate. I followed them to a smaller grove just beyond the eastern ridge. At its center was a stone slab, flat, natural, almost like an altar. On it a worn leather journal. Next to it a photograph. I stepped forward and picked it up. Daniel. Older. Thinner. Unshaven. But alive. The back of the photo read, "He let me go. But I never left. I didn't hear the voice until I turned. It was rough quiet. Real. I didn't take him," it said. He stayed. I turned slowly. Michael Lantry stood about 10 feet away. His beard was longer, face more sunken than the arrest photo, but the scar was still there. The coat looked like it hadn't come off in years. He didn't raise his voice, didn't move closer. He wrote that after I told him everything. I held the journal, told him what Michael looked toward the tree line like the words were still there. That the world out there wasn't built for some of us. That noise follows you even when you hide. But in here, he tapped his chest. Not the woods in here, it quiets. I looked at the picture again. Is he alive? He didn't answer at first, just closed his eyes and exhaled. He was. Maybe still is, but not like before. Later that night I wrote in my own field log. Not as a ranger, just as a sister. He wasn't taken. He was offered silence, and he chose it. I don't know if I could have made the same choice, but I understood it now. This wasn't about a crime. It was about what happens when someone disappears. Not because they were stolen, but because they couldn't live with the noise anymore. And someone else, someone like Lantry, showed them a way out. The kind that doesn't come with answers, just absence. That's what I carried back to the tower. Not guilt, not closure. Just that picture, that voice, and a forest that had kept too many secrets too well for too long. And in the dark, when the wind returned, I heard it again. The whistle. 3 notes, almost musical. Not calling me in, not warning me away. Just reminding me. He's still here. Somewhere. And maybe he always will be. I kept the photograph with me after that night. Folded flat in my front jacket pocket, it felt like the one thing grounding all of this to something real. Daniel, older but unmistakable, standing near a small camp with a stillness that didn't belong to someone on the run. It wasn't just the confirmation that he'd lived, it was the look in his face. Settled, quiet, and knowing. Back at headquarters, we didn't file an incident report, not the usual kind. Miles understood. We logged the coordinates and submitted the photograph for protective handling, but we left the narrative field blank. There wasn't a form that could contain what we were uncovering, not anymore. I spent the next morning pacing the research room while Miles reviewed the recovered journals again. We still didn't know how Daniel had lived that long or where he had gone afterward, and we didn't know what Lantry meant when he said, "He let me go, but I never left." It echoed in my mind. I'd heard the same rhythm in the audio tape in the carvings, even in the journal margins. A pattern forming, something that wasn't finished. That afternoon, we returned to Bare Needle Hollow with 2 additional rangers from base staff, Thomas and Claire, both seasoned, both quiet. No one asked questions during the hike in. Everyone had read the incident notes. Miles led and I followed the rear eyes, scanning for movement or changes in the terrain. The forest felt heavy again, the way it had that first time. Not hostile, just attentive. We widened the search around the clearing and began working sector by sector, looking for any trace of Daniel's presence beyond the photo and the carved initials. What we found wasn't what we expected. 10 minutes north of the stone circle, Claire radioed in something odd beneath a thicket. We cut through and found a pile of stones shaped like an arch. Underneath, a shallow cavity in the soil, and inside it, bones. Small ones. Not human. Placed in symmetrical pairs, always one larger one, smaller, always facing each other. No signs of decay beyond what the forest would naturally allow. They'd been protected deliberately. I knelt beside them and tried to understand. Not burial, not food, something else. Miles crouched next to me and muttered, "She was mimicking people, or trying to." An hour later, we found a second set of carvings etched into a separate post, this one further up the incline toward the northern ledge. This one had initials again DW etched deep, repeated over and over. But now there were new shapes. A square, a spiral, a stick figure with no eyes, no mouth, nothing where a face should be. At first it seemed like more of the same. Then I noticed the depth of the grooves. They weren't idle. They were deliberate, like someone had carved them with focus, as if they held meaning beyond recognition. We brought in a contact from the anthropology team, Dr. Lyndon Ash had been with the university for over 15 years. She flew in that evening and met us on site the following morning. She didn't speak for a while, just studied the post and took photos, measurements, notes. When she finally looked up, her expression had changed. "These aren't indigenous," she said. "And they're not survivalist symbols either. They're synthetic, personal. Someone made this language." I asked her what they meant. She touched the spiral. "It usually means return or trap. Then the square, home, shelter, sometimes boundary. And the faceless figure." Her hand paused above it. "Observer, or watched." I asked which one. She said nothing. As we moved farther into the area, Thomas called out from below a low ridge. Another structure, barely visible beneath a blanket of moss and old stormfall, had collapsed in on itself, but there were signs of use. A tarp corner, burn marks on rock, and beneath one of the stones wrapped in wax cloth, another set of carved figurines. 7 this time, each unique, each bearing the same slash across the face except one. The last one had no slash. It was smooth taller than the rest and carved from a darker wood. I placed it beside the others from earlier, lining them up on a flat surface. It didn't belong with them. Not in style, not in texture. It had been made differently. With care. I didn't say anything, but I didn't have to. Miles stepped beside me and said, "That one's him." We both stared. "But why wasn't it marked?" I asked. He didn't answer. We brought the figurines back to HQ. I laid them out again in the evidence room and started photographing each one, cataloging them by type, material, and wear. That's when the phone rang. One of the technicians from Medford, Elias Harper, had just finished scanning the undeveloped negatives from Daniel's film canister. "You'll want to come down here," he said. "There's something you should see." We drove out the next morning. The photo lab was dim and cold, the hum of the equipment louder than any conversation. Elias projected the image onto a screen. It was a wide shot taken near a fire, same tent from the earlier image, same general layout. But this one had more depth. You could see objects in the background more clearly. A flask, a satchel, and between 2 trees a man, half obscured but unmistakable. Shoulder-length hair, thick beard, heavy coat, the same strap across his chest, the scar on his right cheek. He wasn't looking at the camera, but one eye caught the flash just slightly. Watching. Elias pointed at the shape on his chest. "It's not just a strap," he said. "He's carrying something." Miles leaned in. "Can you zoom in?" The resolution was low, but the outline was there. Some kind of harness, a satchel or pack, and something sticking out of it what looked like the edge of a notebook. I felt my stomach turn. He kept them, I said. Writings, sketches. We asked Elias to run enhancement, sharpen the image as much as possible without losing integrity. It only took another minute. The figure became clearer, not in the face which remained shadowed, but in posture. Intention. He wasn't just present. He was positioned. Like he'd been there long enough to settle into the role of watcher. I didn't say it aloud, but I thought it. He'd been practicing, and by the time Daniel met him, he knew exactly what he was doing. Back at base, I reviewed the carving photos again. Something was bothering me, a detail I hadn't noticed. On one of the posts near the edge of the clearing, the same one with DW etched repeatedly, was a tiny mark almost invisible beneath the others. A different set of initials. ML. Once. Faint, then scratched out. Over it, DW again. I took the file over to Miles. He traced the line with his fingertip and frowned. They overlapped, he said. Not just their lives, their names, their stories. I nodded. One gave way to the other, but it didn't erase him. It replaced him. Outside, the wind shifted through the pine tops, scattering needles across the gravel. Somewhere in the quiet, a faint whistle floated through the trees. 3 short tones. Familiar. Too familiar. Miles looked up. He's still watching. I stepped back from the table, the photo of Daniel still tucked against my ribs, the carved figure beside the notebook. And he knows we are too. We didn't talk much on the hike back in. The wind had picked up along the southern ridge, and the kind of silence that settles into your chest not from fear, but from understanding hung between all of us. Miles walked ahead of me, steady but quiet. He was always the one to speak first on long hikes, to break the stillness with some story from a fire season or a weather anomaly. But not that morning. I think we both knew we weren't tracking something unknown anymore. We were retracing something lived. That made it heavier, more exact. We followed the markers past the first clearing, the one with the stone circle and carved post, and kept going until the terrain changed again, more rocks underfoot, a slight incline canopy thinner. That's where the trail we'd seen in the aerials began to fade. But the soil still held prints. One bare, one booted. Only faint impressions, but deep enough to feel recent. I knelt and traced the edge of one with my glove. Still here, I said. Miles nodded. Or coming back. We split the team radios on, but volume low. Miles took Thomas and looped west toward the tree line. I moved east with Claire, following the slope down toward the creek bed where the first hollow had been. The forest felt different this time. Not more dangerous, just more awake. The air moved in shorter bursts. Even the birds kept distance. We moved slow, not because we were scared, but because whatever was waiting didn't need to be rushed. Claire stopped about 50 yards in. Look, she said. Ahead under a moss-heavy boulder, a second shelter not as hidden as the first, but well-worn. Fire ring. Folded tarp. Tools bundled in paracord. No footprints this time, but the leaves were packed flat. Someone had been there recently. She circled left while I moved to the edge of the fire ring. Something was buried beneath the stones. I lifted them carefully one by one and found a stack of journals. Same type, same hand, tight writing, weathered covers. And then I turned toward the back wall. It took a moment for my eyes to register it. Carvings, not symbols this time. Faces. Hundreds of them, scratched into the stone, layered overlapping. Each one small, featureless, with empty sockets. And under all of them, carved in lines like a mantra, you forget the face, but it never forgets you. I don't know how long I stood there. Claire came around the corner and stopped beside me, eyes wide. He was trying to remember, she said. I shook my head, or trying to forget. We packed the journals in evidence sleeves and marked the perimeter. No signs of immediate danger. But it didn't feel safe either. We moved up trail and met Miles again near the second fork. He hadn't found anything physical, but he'd heard something. 3 low whistles, almost musical, like before. He didn't chase it, just stopped and waited. "He's still watching," he said. "Not hiding. Watching." We didn't debate it, just kept moving. Half a mile deeper near a split cedar, we found another path, thinner, almost invisible. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't already looking for patterns. The leaves had been crushed recently. Boot tread, faint but present. I took point. It led to a third clearing not marked on any of our maps. Circular, maybe 15 feet wide. The trees bowed in at the edges as if the canopy itself had shifted around the space. At the center was a flat stone natural but scarred from use, and resting on it a torn page from a journal. The ink was still legible. "She's coming. She always comes." I held it up, checked both sides. The paper was dry, too dry, recent. We weren't hours behind him. We were minutes. That changed everything. Miles scanned the perimeter. If he's here, he's not running. And then we heard it. A sound low and deliberate, not from the trees but beneath them. Like weight shifting across bark. A figure moved along the far edge of the clearing between the cedars. Not fast, not afraid. We saw the coat first, then the outline of a pack, the beard, the posture, Lantry. We didn't speak, didn't raise our voices. He wasn't looking at us. He was watching the tree line still, like he wasn't guarding something but waiting for it to move. When he did turn, it wasn't abrupt. It was practiced. Calm. His eyes locked on mine, and for the first time I saw something I didn't expect. Not challenge, not recognition, but relief. Like something inevitable had arrived. He didn't speak right away. He just stepped aside and pointed to the brush behind him. We moved slow, no sudden motions. Claire stayed back. Miles and I followed. Behind the thickest patch of pine was a rock ledge with a space beneath it just large enough to crawl through. Inside a fire circle. Cold now. A rolled sleeping bag. And a single photo pinned beneath a stone. Daniel again. This time older still. Sitting beside a fire. Eyes down. Writing. Miles exhaled hard through his nose. He kept him here. But I shook my head. No. He came back here. I turned to Lantry. "Where is he?" He didn't answer. Just tapped the stone once. Then he pulled something from his coat pocket. A cassette. Unlabeled. Worn. He held it out. He wanted it played. Only once. We took it and backed out. Lantry didn't follow. He sat by the fire ring motionless, watching the dark, like he belonged there more than we ever could. Back at base, we loaded the cassette into the deck. The tape hissed for a few seconds. Then a voice, not Lantry's, Daniel's. Older. Steady. If this is being heard, it means she came. She followed it all the way to the end. I don't know if I stayed too long or just long enough, but I chose it. I chose the quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood what he meant. There's a part of you that only wakes up out here. And once it does, it won't go back to sleep. The tape clicked off. No outro, no signature. I didn't say anything for a while. Neither did Miles. The room stayed still the way rooms do when something has just changed. I placed the cassette back in its sleeve and sat with it for a long time. That voice Daniel's, it wasn't uncertain. It wasn't asking for help. He hadn't been lost. Not in the way we'd thought. He'd found something. Chosen it. And now, after all these years, we were the ones still searching. Still trying to understand a decision that was never ours to stop. Somewhere in the woods, the whistle would sound again. 3 notes. And this time I wouldn't wonder who was calling. I'd wonder who was listening. I left the cassette on my desk for most of that night, not ready to file it away, not ready to listen to Daniel's voice fade into the background of all the other evidence boxes we'd built up over the years. When I finally got home, I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood in the doorway watching the treetops shift outside my window. There's a point in any long investigation where the facts stop feeling like tools and start pressing in from the edges. All week, it seemed like the boundaries between myself and the forest had started to blur. I'd hear a whistle or a branch break in the wind and half expect to see a shadow cross the porch, but nothing ever did. The only thing that returned again and again was the memory of Daniel's face, both young and older, caught between leaving and staying, drawn back into the quiet by something no one else could name. The next morning, Miles came by early, carrying the photograph of Daniel, the carved figure, and the last recovered journal. We sat without talking for a while, the way old friends do when the only thing left to share is the truth that can't be spoken. We'd both heard the tape. Both heard Daniel say he chose the quiet. Both understood what that meant. But it wasn't closure. It was a kind of aftermath, something unfinished. We made the decision not to open a full criminal file. There would be no press release, no search teams, no closure for my parents or the others who had lost people to these woods. It felt wrong, but also necessary. There was no perpetrator to catch, no ongoing threat, no neat answer that would put anyone at ease. Daniel had made his choice, and so had Lantry. The only thing I could do was mark the place. That afternoon, I drove back to the fire tower, the one overlooking Bare Needle Hollow, the spot where so much of this had unfolded and folded in on itself. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of wet stone and pine. I placed the carved figurine, the one I believed was Daniel, on the railing, facing out toward the ridgeline. Next to it, I set the photograph protected in a plastic sleeve. Some things belong to the woods, but some deserve to be remembered above them. I didn't stay long, just long enough to feel the wind shift and the sun fall behind the western slope. Just long enough to know he was part of this place now, not just a missing person, not a crime to be solved, but a presence that wouldn't let itself be erased. Back at headquarters, I filed a short report. Bare Needle Hollow, no further action recommended. I wrote my personal reflections in a private log, not for the agency, but for myself. I wrote about what it meant to search for someone who had already found what he wanted, even if that meant losing everything that came before. I wrote about Lantry not as a suspect or as a villain, but as a shadow drawn to quiet the same way Daniel had been. The difference was that Lantry had learned to survive, had found a way to keep going even as the rest of the world forgot his name. Daniel had chosen to disappear. Lantry had taught him how. In the weeks that followed, there were a few calls from family, from old friends, asking if there had been any new developments, any hope. I told them the only thing I could, that we had found some answers, but not the ones they were hoping for. There was no body to bury, no remains to identify, just a set of signs that pointed deeper into the trees and never came back out. Some took comfort in that. Others didn't. Miles kept an eye on the northern trailheads for a while, just in case, but nothing ever turned up. The post with Daniel's initials stayed untouched. The carved figurines weathered slowly on my windowsill, faded by sunlight, but never removed. At night, when the wind pressed against the glass, I'd hear a faint whistle, 3 notes, like always. Sometimes I wondered if it was real. Sometimes I knew it was just the trees. There are stories that never find an ending, not because the truth can't be known, but because it can't be told. Daniel's story became one of those. Not a cautionary tale, not a ghost story, just a record of what happens when someone steps out of the noise and finds a silence so complete they never want to leave it. The investigation closed with no charges, no prosecution, nothing for the headlines. But for those of us who had followed it to the end, it became something else, a kind of quiet justice, a way of letting go even if you can never truly forget. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake thinking I hear his voice on the tape or see a light flicker between the trees outside my window. Sometimes I think about Lantry alone somewhere out in that wild country, carving faces into stone, building new rituals for himself, waiting for someone else to understand what only he and Daniel ever did. The silence isn't empty. It's full of everything that won't be spoken. And sometimes that's all the justice there is. Sometimes the work you do follows you long after the paperwork is filed and the evidence boxes are shelved. It settles into the quieter parts of your life, unexpected but not unwelcome. I still think about Daniel, about how he was both lost and found in the same breath. How some people aren't taken from us by violence or accident, but by something quieter, something that lives in the space between memory and silence. I think about Michael Lantry, too, the way he became both witness and warden out there in those woods, teaching someone else how to survive, how to disappear when the world felt too loud. There are nights when I sit on my porch, coffee cooling in my hands, and the sound of wind in the pines brings back the rhythm of those days, the long hikes, the hush beneath the canopy, the certainty that I was being watched. It doesn't frighten me now. If anything, I understand it better than I ever did before. Miles still stops by sometimes with an old map or a new theory, sometimes just for the comfort of sharing a story with someone who lived it too. We don't talk much about what we lost. We talk more about what remains, the carved figurine I keep on the window ledge, the photo of Daniel, older and at peace in his own way, the certainty that some endings don't belong to the ones left behind. I've come to believe that justice doesn't always look like a courtroom or a confession. Sometimes it's the act of remembering, keeping a name in the light, refusing to let silence erase the truth of who someone was or why they left. The forest keeps its secrets. It always has. But I carry what I learned there with me, a kind of quiet resilience. The knowledge that even when answers run out, what matters most is the care you bring to the questions you keep asking. There's no shame in not finding everything you hoped for. There's only the responsibility to try and to honor the stories you uncover. That's what I hope for Daniel and for anyone listening who's ever lost someone to a place or a silence that can't be reached. If this story found its way into your own memories, if it brushed against something you've carried, to share it or leave a thought in the comments. It helps keep the stories alive and the names with them. Thanks for staying with me to the end.